Now listen here, the absolute best thing I ever did in my entire life was buying my principal residence in cash from money I saved from 40 years working in the coal mine. Wasn't your best decision marrying grandma? No, you're missing the point. The best thing you can do is buy a house. Grandpa, I agree, but I'm not sure if buying a house in 2020 is the best decision. A lot's changed since the 1950s. Hope you guys enjoyed the skit. We're trying to bring a little bit more levity to my YouTube video, so let us know in the comment section down below. But in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you why buying a house is maybe not the best financial advice that your parents are giving you. Alright, now let's have the serious conversation about whether you should buy or rent your principal residence, your home. Now, when we're talking about buying a house, which is what we're going to cover first, a lot of friends and family are going to push you into buying a home. And this brings me to the first pro when it comes to buying a home, and that's the forced savings plan. Now, what I mean by a forced savings plan is every single month that you're paying down your mortgage, you're actually paying a portion of the principal. And as you reduce that debt obligation over time, you're building up an asset. So a lot of people struggle to have financial discipline. And this is the reason that they believe buying a home is the best personal finance piece of advice that they can give you. Now, this is correct and incorrect in my opinion. It's correct because if that person struggles with self-discipline and being financially responsible, then probably buying a home was the best decision that they could make. However, if you've got a little bit of self-discipline, it may not actually be the best decision you can make, but it is definitely a forced savings plan. Now, moving on to the second pro when we're talking about buying a home is the stability in regards to your fixed costs. Now, what I mean about stability in regards to your fixed costs is simply the concept that you've bought your home and now you know what your mortgage payments are going to be over a certain term. However, we still do have a little bit of exposure to CPI, so the Consumer Price Index or inflation, let's call it. So when we're looking at inflation here, our costs for utilities, property taxes, insurance, all those are still actually variable. So I would argue this is technically a pro, but it's not as big of a pro as a lot of people make it out to be. There still actually is a fair bit of price instability when it comes to your cost of owning a home. Now, the third pro we're going to talk about is it conforms to social norms. Now, this may seem a little bit like a joke, but it's not. People will just let you buy a house all the time, and friends and family will pat you on the back. They're going to high-five you. And it just fits within the social narrative that they're used to. So sometimes going with the flow can make life a bit easier. So I'm not going to discount that. Finally, there's also the emotional aspect. A lot of people have emotional connections to their principal residence. This concept that your house is your castle, you know, that sort of thing. Now, if we're looking at things through a rational, logical lens, we really shouldn't even be counting that as a pro, but I'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch upon it. Now, looking at cons, there's the sunk costs. Now, what I mean by this is when you buy a home, there's a bunch of expenses related to buying that home. You've got closing costs, maybe land transfer tax, legal fees, really depends upon your local jurisdiction. But in addition, if you decide that you want to sell that property the next day, there's costs associated with selling that property as well. So you've got things like realtor fees. And a lot of markets, realtor fees could be anywhere from 4 to 6% of the sale price of the home. So if you bought a house for $100,000 and decide to sell it the next day, odds are you're going to lose 4 to 6% or $4,000 to $6,000 on the purchase of that home because you've got to pay a realtor to sell it. The next point I want to focus on is the lack of flexibility. So because of those sunk costs, inherently people don't want to move around a lot unless they're in a very hot real estate market where the appreciation's rising at such a great rate that it kind of bails them out of that sunk cost of the realtor fees, closing costs, legal fees, all that stuff. So again, there's a perception of lack of flexibility where, say, a renter can easily move every single year. A homeowner, usually not going to be the best financial decision for them to move every single year. And then finally, the big con here is it's not actually always financially optimal to buy a home. And this is where you really need to look at your local market. In certain markets, landlords are literally subsidizing, which means paying for tenants to live in their home. Now, this doesn't mean that they're literally handing out money. What this means is their cost of owning and operating that rental property is greater than the rent that they're bringing in. In this case, it's usually going to be financially optimal to actually be a renter in that market. Now, you may think that this sounds insane or crazy, but in a lot of rent-controlled or partially rent-controlled markets, this is actually a reality. So really important you understand specifically what's going on in your local real estate market to figure out whether buying a home is financially optimal. But that's just the buying a home aspect. Let's dive into the actual concept of renting your principal residence and whether that's a good idea or bad idea. So the first pro is that flexibility. As a renter, we can always just move. And in fact, in a lot of markets, after you've been renting for a year, you maybe only have to give 30 or 60 days notice. Makes it really easy for especially young people that want flexibility in their life. And at the start of your career, at the start of your journey in life, once you've graduated university or high school or whatever, you know, that flexibility can really help you increase your personal earning potential. And this personal earning potential, especially if you can ramp it up at the start of your life, that's going to last throughout your entire lifetime. So, for example, if you're geographically tethered because you bought a home and you can't really afford to move for the next 3 to 5 years, you're only going to be able to take jobs or opportunities that are geographically close to you. Now, sure, with telecommuting and things like that, we may see that dissipate and be less of a pressure, but certainly today, that's a big factor that a lot of young people overlook when they're considering the rent versus buy debate. Now, the other pro here is the opportunity to rent and then save the difference. So usually when we look from just a straight cash outflow perspective, renting is usually going to have less net cash outflow than, say, buying a home. Now, the reason people like buying a home is that forced savings plan we talked about earlier. However, that forced savings plan is directly into one asset class, which if you look at studies like the Case-Shiller index, would argue is only really keeping up with inflation or just slightly beating inflation. Whereas if we rent and save the difference, we can actually take our savings and invest it into whatever, you know, financial asset or investment option that makes the most sense to optimize for our personal situation. So again, really depends upon your personal risk tolerance and factors like that, but this is something you need to take into consideration. And then finally, the last pro that I'm going to bring up is a lot of markets actually have rent control, whether it be partial rent control or 100% real rent control. And understand, those rent control markets, that actually creates stability for the renter because your landlord can't just double your rent overnight. So for example, in markets like California, New York, or Ontario, Canada, all those markets have some form of rent control, which actually creates rent stability or price stability for the tenant. And under those circumstances, I would argue the tenant in a perfect rent control market actually has more price stability than any sort of homeowner or landlord because they don't have to worry about the price instability of things like property taxes. Now, moving on to the cons when it comes to renting, you know, less emotional connection. Straight up, most people aren't going to have the same emotional connection to a property they rent versus a property they own. Now, is this a big deal? That's really a personal decision that you need to decide. But if we're looking at buying or renting through the lens of just the financial decision, what's financially optimal, our emotions really shouldn't come into play into this logical, rational decision. Second, we've got less control. Again, this is going to depend upon your exact market. But in general, as a tenant, you probably can't just blow out that wall if you want to. You probably can't just build a deck onto the back of your home if you'd like. So this is something that really aggravates a lot of people. They want to be able to really have complete control over their castle, and renting sometimes won't do that. However, again, it's really up to our personal situation. Maybe you can build a strong relationship with your landlord and get some of the nice amenities that you would like to have. And then finally, let's talk about landlord-friendly jurisdictions. So there are jurisdictions out there that are landlord-friendly. I just happen not to live in one. And in those landlord-friendly jurisdictions, your landlord might be able to double your rent payments one month. And under that scenario, in those circumstances, yes, there definitely is cost instability in that regards. However, you still have the flexibility that we talked about here to always move to another city and find more reasonable either rent control rules or just more reasonable landlords. So that's it as a quick synopsis of whether you should buy or rent a home. Hopefully you guys now understand that it's always a very personal decision. You're going to have to look at your personal factors, what your goals are, and really what's going to get you there under the most optimal conditions. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer. I know people like silver bullets when it comes to personal finances, but understand you need to dive deep into your personal situation as well as your local real estate market to get an understanding of whether you should be buying or renting when it comes to your principal residence. All right, that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, hit the subscribe button if you're new to my channel, but also make sure you check out some of the other amazing financial advice we've got for you on the channel here, like this video, or maybe check out this playlist. But remember, buying a house may not be the right advice for you, so take it with a grain of salt when your parents or grandparents try and shove it down your throat.